Okay, so why don't we turn to the book of Amos? And one of the first things I want to point out, of course, is that these books, as I said, the prophets were primarily preachers. And so the books of the prophets that we have been called, assembled, compiled, perhaps by others. It could be that the prophets wrote some of their speeches. They have the certain quality of oral preaching, much the way a contemporary preacher preaches. Martin Luther King preached this way. Sometimes he had a text, and sometimes he left his text. In fact, his greatest speeches are his greatest oratory is when he leaves his speeches and just reaches into his gut and preaches. And I would suspect that that is probably true of these men as well. And the fact that, there are third parties who are compiling these works is actually evidenced by the very, very beginning of the prophet Amos, and all of the prophets, by the way. All of the books of the prophets begin with what we call an incipit, I-N-C-I-P-I-T. That is a little introductory remark indicating who is this prophet, when did this prophet live, and any other possible background information that the editor of this book wants us to know. It's written in the third person. It's not written by Isaiah. He doesn't say I. He says the words of Amos. I'm sorry, Amos, not Isaiah. And who he was, when he lived. You notice the reference to kings of Judah and the king of Israel, Jeroboam. And it's also reference to an earthquake. And if you look at the very last paragraph of the introduction right above where the book of Amos begins in our version of the Bible, it will tell you a little bit about some background about that earthquake. But I think what I really love most about this beginning of the book of Amos is, we didn't talk about in our literary strategies at the beginning of the semester about rhetoric and how the prophets make use of rhetorical devices to make a point. You'll first see in verse 3, this is Amos chapter 1, verse 3. First of all, he says, "Thus says the Lord." That's our typical orator format. Our typical oracle format. An oracle will begin, "Thus says the Lord." The prophet is speaking in the name of God. And he goes through a sort of, it sounds like a very formulaic kind of expression here. "For 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they have threshed Gilead." Remember, Gilead is where Jephthah lived on the border of the Aramean territory. They have threshed Gilead with threshing sledges of iron, etc. And you'll notice that it goes on in verse 6, "Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4, it sounds like a kind of a litany, a standard formula of the crimes and punishments of various kingdoms. And we notice that all of these kingdoms are probably enemies of Israel, or potential enemies or adversaries of Israel. And I can sort of imagine the people standing out on the square, or out on the green, or in the village square, listening to this preacher preach, and getting very excited, and getting a very positive feeling about how this preacher is preaching against all of their enemies, and how God is going to take care of all of Israel's enemies, until he gets to chapter 2, verse 4. So imagine everybody's all agitated and excited about the preacher preaching against Israel's enemies, until we come to chapter 2, verse 4, and he says, "Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment, because they have rejected the law of the Lord, and have not kept his statutes, but they have been led astray by the same lies after which their ancestors walked. So I will send a fire on Judah, and it shall devour the strongholds of Jerusalem." So at this point, the people, if he's preaching in the northern kingdom, might be getting a little suspicious. I mean, they're people from the kingdom of Israel. They're not Judeans. He's preaching against the Judeans here. But, these are their brothers, their brethren. They might be getting a little nervous here that he's gone through all the enemies, and now he comes to the kingdom of Judah. But then, if they were getting a little nervous, they should be, because in verse 6 he says, "Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment. Now notice what the crime is here. Because they sell the righteous for silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals. They who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth, and push the afflicted out of the way. Father and son go into the same girl, so that my holy name is profaned. I'm not sure what that means. Maybe some sort of cultic prostitution. I'm not really sure. Verse 8, they lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge, and in the house of their God they drink wine bought with the fines they imposed. And so this is their crime. This is their punishment. They are trampling the needy. They are being insensitive to poor people. They are using their new prosperity under Jeroboam II to take advantage of the poor. But really, I think my favorite part of the book of Amos is when he goes to chapter 5, verse 21. And this is really a theme that I want to really follow through in the 3 prophets that we're going to study. It's very clear that the prophets have a set of complaints that they have against the people, against the 2 kingdoms. One is, of course, apostasy. That is, the people engaging in some form of foreign worship or idol worship, and that's a major theme. But there's another major theme here that I find most interesting, and that is the sort of placing of formal ritual, formal worship, what we might call going to church, as it were, placing that ahead of the social responsibilities that these prophets understand are the core of the values and the mission that they understand are the core values and the core mission of these people. And so when we go to Amos chapter 5, beginning in verse 21, it says, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Did you bring to me sacrifices and offerings the 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? That's a very odd verse, because indeed, if we were to look in the Pentateuch, in the Torah, the instructions for all of these offerings, the burnt offerings and the grain offerings and the offerings of well-being, are all laid out in the book of Leviticus, in the Torah, which is said to have been established while during the time that the Israelites were wandering through the wilderness. So it would seem to me that the answer to Amos's question, did you bring to me sacrifices and offerings the 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? The answer, it seems to me, would be, well, certainly we did, because that's what's instructed of us in the Torah, in the Pentateuch. But Amos is questioning that, and he's questioning the need for, or certainly the preponderance, the preeminence of sacrifice and formal ritual in the temple, in the shrine, over against social justice. And in that balance, in that comparison between those 2 missions, those 2 values, he clearly places social justice above formal worship. So there's really those 2 themes that run throughout the prophetic books. The theme of apostasy, that is foreign worship, worship of other gods, worship of the Baalim, the Canaanite gods, but also the fact that worship itself, formal worship in the temple, it does not have precedence. It's not sufficient. It does not take precedence over the social responsibilities of the people. So that's really all I want to talk about Amos right now. I'd like to actually go now to Isaiah and go to the beginning of his book, Isaiah chapter 1, and you'll see that we have that same idea that I was developing in when I first started looking at the book of Amos, the fact that the book actually begins in the third person, that is, some editor has come along and compiled these various writings and offered this incipit, this introduction, to tell us who this fellow is and when he lived. This is Isaiah chapter 1, verse 1. The vision of Isaiah, son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Ahaz we know from the Syro-Ephraimite war. Hezekiah we know from the invasion of King Sennacherib. But I want to just point out a couple of other things here. Again, just literary things of interest that you might want to pay attention to. We talked, we read in the Gable book a little bit about how Hebrew poetry works through parallelism. You see a perfect example of parallelism here. He says in verse 2, "Hear, O heavens, and listen, O earth." So there's two verbs of hearing and then heaven and earth. Those are parallel verses. He says, "For the Lord has spoken, I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master's crib." You hear the parallelism there as well. The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master's crib. Those are two parallel stitches, two parallel halves of the line. But Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Perfect use of symbolism in this verse, comparing, a donkey, an ox, an animal understands who is responsible and who is in charge, but this people does not understand that their God is in charge and that they have responsibility. But he then goes on, he says, if you go, for instance, in verses 4 and 5 and 6, he talks about how the children have dealt corruptly, they've forsaken God, and he doesn't understand, the prophet doesn't understand why the people are behaving this way. They're in bad shape. He says in verse 7, "Your country lies desolate, your cities are burned with fire. In your very presence aliens devour your land. It is desolate as overthrown by foreigners, and daughter Zion," that's another name for Jerusalem, "and daughter Zion is left like a booth in a cucumber, like a booth in a vineyard, like a shelter in a cucumber field, like a besieged city." Now that is clearly, in my opinion, a reference to the siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib in 701 BCE. And Isaiah says, "If the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, we would have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah." In other words, we have been rescued. We were rescued from this siege because God has rescued the city. Had God not rescued the city, we would have been utterly destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, in a way, it's again, he's using some rhetoric here because that sounds like a good thing, that we've been rescued. We haven't been like Sodom and Gomorrah. But then he goes on, "Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the teaching of our God, you people of Gomorrah." In other words, you may think you got off the hook. You're not like Sodom and Gomorrah. You haven't been utterly destroyed, but you are like Sodom and Gomorrah in your evil and in your wickedness. And I'm going to stop here and start the next section forthwith.